there is now. And so we've kind of grown along with that. And so what that means, what that money means kind of physically, taking it from the conceptual to the actual real, there's been several shows that were lost. All of radio drama, we were the last people doing radio drama in Canada, and that's now gone. So that's part of our cultural fabric that we just don't have anymore. Bureaus and foreign, and both here and foreign, have been closed. I'm sure in the context of this panel, it's interesting that Radio 2 is now becoming commercial radio. Live recording across the country was cut, which is a big deal for Canadian artists who have a hard time getting attention of recording studios outside of Canada. The Halifax production studio was closed, meaning that there are now no production studios. Sorry, this is the future, it hasn't happened yet, but as of a few years from now, there will be no production studios east of Montreal. And RCI, which was Canada's voice to the world, has also been closed. And RCI was interesting in that it was something that broadcast both here and abroad and often connected new immigrants to their families at home, because their families at home could listen to RCI and have things to talk about their family's new life in Canada. And the CBC has been involved in expanding to putting new radio stations in new cities like Waterloo and Kamloops, and many of those new stations are now not going to happen, and many of them will be digital only. But mostly what's happening, so that seems like a long list, but it's actually a pretty short one considering the size of the cut. Mostly people are doing more with less, and in terms of workers, what that means is people are having workload problems, people are having stress, people are burning out, people are going on sick leave. And there are more repeats, the quality of journalism is lower. I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with journalists who say, you know, I really want to do this enterprise story, but I can't do it because we don't have the resources, we don't have the time. I have to go deal with this, you know, kind of mundane but very important story. And I have to do it for radio and television and the web because there just isn't enough resources for me to do this other story that no one's going to get if I don't get it. And so what's happening is that as the CBC is asked to do the same amount of work or more work as you know, what media needs expands, with less and less funding, the quality of the service suffers more and more. And people don't tend to get angry when the recession is used as an excuse to cut. However, what we're concerned about is as these smaller cuts add up, the CBC becomes increasingly irrelevant. And what will happen is eventually, as these cuts pile up and the CBC is able to do less and do lower quality work, eventually it will be cut to the point of irrelevance. And at that point, no one will care when it's shuttered totally. And so what we believe is that these cuts aren't actually about the recession, they're fully ideological. The Harper government is not above calling the CBC and asking people, and telling people that they don't like the way that they were presented. The CBC has an allegedly arm's length relationship, but the length of that arm is sometimes shorter than others. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives consistently blame the CBC for bias, which, you know, I would say that if you're the media and the ruling party thinks that you're being harsher on them than you are on the opposition, that's the way it's supposed to be. But that's not really the way that either of those parties tend to view things. And Tyler spoke as well about the idea that the CBC does or should compete with the privates. That's not really true, but it's taken as this kind of, the CBC is stealing advertising dollars. Well, frankly, the CBC has no interest in stealing advertising dollars. The CBC just wants to survive and would kind of do just fine if it were actually just fully funded by the government. The final thing I would say is that part of this challenge is that, you know, neither of the two parties in power have ever stood up and said, when they've been in a chance to win an election, have ever said, we're going to cut the CBC if you elect us. That is something that's kind of way down on their platform, so it never becomes an election issue. And what that means is that there's never really a chance for people to stand up and say, you know, the CBC is actually really, really important to us and we don't want to see it cut. It just never turns into a political issue at that level. And I think that's one of the major challenges we're facing, is how to turn that into an actual political issue.
Thanks, Jean. What has that meant for the CMG in terms of, so I have a lot of those, you know, it's sad to hear the RCIs. When I was at CBC, I worked a lot with RCI. I used to joke with RCI that one day they would be the most important part of CBC because they were the only non-English, non-French unit of the entire place. And you know, we, at the time that we launched CBC News World, or CBC Vancouver's local news site, we discovered there were 8 Chinese-speaking CBC journalists working out of Montreal that broadcast Canadian news to China. And so that was the only way some people in China would get news around the world, because they could find a way to hide it inside CBC's website so it wouldn't get censored. And it was a really important channel to what was happening in Canada. But in terms of the CMG's response, has that resulted in layoffs or just redistribution of people?
Yes, there were quite a few layoffs over the summer. Certainly, most of the folks you were talking about in RCI were freelancers who didn't have much in the way of job security and are now hopefully finding other work outside the CBC. Many of the people from RCI were laid off. Some of them were able to be put into local newsrooms. There were, I don't have an exact number, but the number of jobs cut were in the hundreds. The number of actual permanent people that lost their jobs is smaller. But then when you count the temporary employees and freelancers and contract people that also lost their work, and the independent productions which were cancelled, so all of the people associated with an independent production, really the number, it was a substantial shrinking of the culture and media sector in Canada.
Thank you, Jean. I'd like to now shift our attention to not the CBC. We often forget that community radio is also part of public media, and maybe in some ways the purest form or current purest form of public media. We've heard Tyler and Jean respond to some questions, and we live in a culture where unless something is commercialized, it's not always recognized as having value, and this is one of these challenges. Sylvia, I'm interested to ask you, how do you as a media producer evaluate what you do when it's not commercialized, and do you see this in a different way, and do you see Latin Waves as always being an independent, non-commercial project, or does it have a future as a monetized property, and if so, how would that change the character of the show?
I want to begin by acknowledging that we are sitting in unceded territory, and that this should not just be something that we say without reflection, because it speaks to the kinds of narratives that define us. We are our stories. We are the kinds of metaphors we use on a day-to-day basis. We are and see the world through those metaphors. So if the world is organized in a competitive, winner-take-all kind of attitude, that shapes how we see each other, how we notice each other. Are there our competition, or can we collaborate? And so that shapes what we valorize, the kinds of relationships that we welcome, the kinds of connections that we make in our world. When we talk about the relationship between media, whether we call the CBC public media and commercial media something else, someone would argue, well, commercial media is also public. In fact, they probably have more access to the public than CBC because of their sheer monopoly through the airwaves. That's a contentious issue. Now, the problem with that acceptance or kind of cynicism that we take as media producers, as media consumers, as people who enjoy and simply see there are different possibilities, there are other ways of being, shapes what approaches we take. And I want to begin by telling you a story, because that's the best way I think we relate to our world. For most of us, the idea of revolution is very exciting. It's a very romantic notion of how we create change. We celebrate the Tunisian revolution. We have names for every revolution. The spring uprising. So there was, in the Balkans there was the winter, and so we have different kinds of labeling and claiming these things in a way that almost commodifies the resistance, the level of engagement the communities have taken over centuries to resist paradigms of domination. This idea that the only way we can organize our society is with this power over, someone controlling, elites over a majority, or however you want to conceptualize. For me, media means the right to have a voice. Media means visibility. Media means being able to imagine and redraft those borders that you were speaking about earlier, Terry. Reimagine a world without borders. And this was very exemplified in the Oaxaca uprising, almost now 6-7 years ago. The media, of course, didn't cover the story, but the teachers in Oaxaca have a different way of seeing their role. They see education as preparing their students for life. Education as being something that we engage as part of our journey to recognize our responsibility to our communities. In Oaxaca, there was a different way of educating. They used to call them rurales normales, where the rural was not something to be shunned or stay away, but rather recognizing the indigenous people have languages. The indigenous people have their own cultural basis that they can found and help us grow from. And so the students were educated in multiple languages, and of course, being in a colonized state, we learned Spanish. But many people learn Mayan, Mam, the multitude of languages spoken in Oaxacan territories. And so this was always a contested place. And every year the teachers come, and every year the teachers would be striking because they would be under the foot of cutbacks and more rollbacks. And so there's this dance that we play, where with relationships of domination with the government, and relinquishing the authority of the state as something that we simply just have to obey. And so the plantons come out, and there would be, massive occupations of the center square. And so every year the police would come, and they would just sit around, and the government would say, no, we're not going to back down, we're not going to concede. And of course, after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they would both come, and a settlement would be reached. This time, they, faced with the war on terror, faced with this new narrative that began to color how we saw our relations. The government had manipulated this narrative and militarized the streets. And this time, rather than conceding, rather than coming to the table and making some mediocre compromise, they decided to attack. They simply sent the forces and, started throwing bombs at the crowds, right? And if you've never been in a protest where, smoke bombs are thrown at you, you probably don't know how to react to that. But most people in Latin America know that the best thing to do is you wash your eyes with Coca-Cola, you cover your face, you try to prevent, so you can breathe. And so immediately, the only source of information that people had to connect to what was happening was the local independent radio who broadcasted this. And this happened at 3 a.m. in the morning. By 7 a.m., the whole community had come out en masse. Normally when you hear people tell you there are shooting, there are shootouts, you don't go there, you want to go away from it. This is very different. People started coming en masse to the center, and as the bombs were thrown at them, they would pick them up and throw them back at the police, and now they had things to cover their faces, and they had regroup. By 8 o'clock, the whole center had been retaken. This went on for months. Of course, the media didn't think this was a story worth telling. We heard very little, maybe sound bites, 10-second sound bites, in the media, even progressive media. And so the people kept going on these demonstrations, 250,000 people on the demonstration, and no notice. And on one of these demonstrations, the women said, this is ridiculous. Let's just take it where it matters. And they took a detour. So the demonstration continued, and the women took a detour, probably about 1,000 women, and they went directly to the TV station.